Well, appreciate you inviting me here. I've had a number of classes with Becky as a student and with Gavin as a professor, and so I've heard lots about your church, and it's all good things. So it's nice to be here in person to talk about a really tough subject. So I became interested in MAiD only recently. I think it's 2022 when I was invited to a seminar on MAiD, and I kind of mentioned to some folks in our church, I don't think I'll go because I don't think this really impacts us. If I had to give a picture of what MAiD was, I'd say it's probably somebody very, very ill, dying of some painful disease, stomach cancer or something like that, that was incurable. They had done all the treatments, they'd done everything they could do. Pain medication was not cutting it. They were going to be dead within a couple weeks anyway. And so I saw this as something that the government at least was posing as very rare and very merciful. And whatever reservations I had of it, I thought of it was quite out there. So the congregants I was mentioning this to agreed. They said, yeah, I don't think this really affects us, so we just won't go. But in the weeks that followed, I was a bit surprised because people would come alongside me and just kind of, not quite whisper in my ear, but very low-key say, my neighbor took MAiD. My uncle was offered MAiD in the hospital, and we didn't know what to do. I was offered MAiD at a time in my life where I didn't feel like I had other options. And one by one, these stories started growing until I began to think, this might have actually affected us far more than I realized. At one point, I did a very informal poll in our church just asking, how many of you know somebody who has been offered or taken MAiD? Like first person, know somebody. And about a third of the hands went up. And that was enough for me to think, I better learn something about this. So I went to that seminar and I realized how little I knew. I went to another seminar. It was full of all the horror stories and every awful thing that possibly could have happened. But it also made me think maybe this is hyperbole, maybe he's just telling the bad stories. Went to another seminar, and as I kept going and listening to these things, I thought, I kept having people come and tell me their stories. And I wondered, why aren't we telling each other? Why is this something nobody's talking about? Why do we all think that it's out there and it never happens when it felt like everybody I met had a story? And so I began to have conversations with our own congregation, just, hey, how has MAiD affected you? What do you think of it? And I found people got passionate because they all had some stake in the game, may I say? Maybe it was somebody from 50 years ago when they wish MAiD had been available and it wasn't. And so they had to watch this horrible death and they never want to go through that again. Or maybe they were in the hospital system where they didn't have a choice but to be there when MAiD was offered to these patients. Or maybe somebody they loved had taken MAiD, but one by one these stories came out, and I realized a couple things. One was that we are not talking about the same thing when we say MAiD, that we didn't have a common ground. Two is that I think people's opinions on MAiD have changed drastically in the last 10 years, and I was very curious as to why. I felt like if I had come here 10 years ago and had a poll and said, who here is against MAiD? In a church it would have been 100%, or maybe one person abstaining because they didn't feel it was okay to say otherwise. Whereas today, 86% of Christians say they are for MAiD. So that's a fairly significant shift, and I wanted to know how that happened. Was that just, we'd always thought that, and now we were allowed to say it? Or had that changed over time? And I also cared deeply what the Bible says about it, and how the church should we respond. Should we be out there picketing? Should we be for this? There's a MAiD death that happened in a church here in Winnipeg not that long ago. Is that the way we should be doing this? Is saying, come here and have a peaceful death? How do we respond to this? So I won't solve all the problems or answer all the questions tonight, but I'll hopefully take you on a bit of a journey that I've been on understanding what MAiD is, not what we think it should be, not our ideas of it, not what it used to be, but what it is currently. What I think I think the Bible speaks to it, and what it means for us as a church to respond. So with that, let me just go into a brief overview. MAiD stands for Medical Assistance in Dying, and in Canada it's been legal since 2016. So we had, in fact, before that, in the early 90s, we had a case that brought it to Supreme Court where they wanted it to become legal, and it was shut down because they said life is sacred. But in 2016 it came up again, and this time it was legalized because they said you actually lose, it's a human right is how they put it. And it was a person with ALS who knew she didn't want to die of ALS. So she wanted to die earlier. She figured, if I have to do it myself, I'm going to commit suicide today. But if you'll let me wait till it's progressed far enough, then I'll get a doctor to do it for me, and so I'll actually gain life back. And so she said that if you don't allow MAiD, you are costing me life. And with that argument, they said, okay, we agree. And so as a human right, it became legal in Canada. Now, it has changed a lot since then, and it's going to change more. Just some differences. Back then, death had to be in the foreseeable future, so you had to be terminally ill to get it. Today, we also include intolerable suffering, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Then you had to request it. Now it's allowed to be offered. Then you needed 2 independent witnesses. Now you need only 1. Then there was a 90-day waiting period and a 10-day reflection period. Today we have 2 streams. So if you are terminally ill, you can get MAiD within 24 hours. If it's intolerable suffering, there's still the 90-day waiting period, but there's a lot of gray area on how to define that, so there's stories of it happening either way. So this is a quote from a group called Macdonald Laurier Institute. They are a think tank out of Ottawa. They're not Christian at all, but I thought they summed up very well what we understood of MAiD and what it actually is. So they say, whereas Canadians first understood MAiD as a rare and merciful end, when medicine had nothing left to offer, MAiD is now marketed as a treatment option to manage fear of eventual suffering, to eliminate the pain of loneliness and isolation, and even as a viable option when social needs cannot be met. Now, if that's true, we have a problem. So this is where I went with this. Is it rare? Is it merciful? Or is it what they claim? Here are some stats. Now, I'm not the only one that thought it was only out there. When they first started MAiD in Canada, the early estimates was about 100 people in Canada would die from MAiD every year. So across 12 provinces, that's not many. The likelihood of you knowing somebody is pretty slim. But they found over 1,000 people took it the first year, and it's been rising steadily ever since at a rate of about 30-ish% every year. And the way we have it now, we have now legalized MAiD for mental illness. Now that won't come into effect for 3 more years, but it's past the law stage. So we are increasing availability for it. So it's not looking to plateau anytime soon. Now I know a lot of people say, yeah, early years, you always have that early increase, but it should have plateaued, and it's not, and it's probably not going to. So from the time MAiD became legal in Canada, 2016 through 2021, 31,664 people, Canadians, have died under the legislation. So that's not very rare, is it? A lot of these stats will end in 2021 because the government of Canada did a big study on it in 2022, and so I'm trying to take these from what we would agree are legitimate sources and not from the others, but there's lots out there. So numbers sometimes mean nothing until you compare them with something. So let's do some comparisons. California's may be the easiest comparison because they also legalized MAiD in 2016, so the same time, and the population of California is about the same as the population of Canada. So they make for a pretty good case study. Well, in that same period when we had over 31,000 deaths, they had about 3,000. I had an interesting comment that's really haunted me ever since, and they said, if you had inversed that would make sense to me because we have public health care. We have palliative care. You can get free medication to manage your pain. You can get free access to this. In California, you have to pay for it all, so that if you told me that they were dying at 10 times the rate we were, that would make sense to me. But that is the complete inverse. That's really hard to explain. If we look in the global community, now, I really thought this was kind of everywhere, and Canada was one of the few that was catching up. It's only available in about 9 countries in the world, and we have some of the least restrictions on it. Just by comparison, as of 2022, Quebec led the world in percentage of deaths by MAiD at 5.1% of all their deaths were through MAiD. The Netherlands, which is known as the most liberal, so it's already available for mental illness in Netherlands, they're at 4.8%. At this time, this time in 2022, Canada was at 4.1%, but it was rising. Belgium at 2.3%, and some of you might know Switzerland used to be kind of the place for this, right? Everyone went to Switzerland for their deaths. Well, they're only at 1.9%. So Canada is not performing well on the world stage. This is a quote from the World Medical Journal. They said, within 6 years, Canada has surpassed all other countries for its number of euthanasia and assisted suicide deaths reported in 2021. So now we're not talking about percentages, we're talking about numbers, and Canada does not have a big population. So that's fairly surprising. If we go a bit closer to home, it's not legal nationally in the US, but there's a few states that have legalized it. And Oregon is one of the first. Back when we voted against MAiD, they voted for MAiD. And so they've had it going for quite a while, and I think it's because of their stats that we initially estimated we would be at 100 deaths a year. Here's where they land. Quebec is at 5.1%, Canada as a whole at 4.1%, California 0.2% of deaths, and Oregon it's actually 0.001%. That's a difference. That's a big difference. And this is where I'd love to tell you why. I don't know why. I have one thought on it, and that is the difference between euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. So MAiD encompasses both. Both are legal in Canada. One is self-administered, so you'd be given a lethal dose of pills that you take yourself at the time of your choosing. The other is given by a physician or a nurse practitioner where they give you, it's usually a lethal injection. In Canada, both are legal. In both Oregon and California, only the self-administered, so only the physician-assisted suicide counts and is legal. Now, why does it matter? I don't know, but in Ontario, in a 4-year period, they had 12,675 MAiD deaths, and of those, only 2 were self-administered. So there's something about having someone else do it that makes it more accessible. And I don't know if it's because you actually put it on your calendar and it's scheduled, or if it's because it's easier, or I can't explain why, but I think that that plays into this more than we expect. So I mentioned before, in 2018, here in Canada, we allowed for MAiD for what we call intolerable suffering, or irremediable conditions. How is this decided? And that makes a big difference. So in Belgium and the Netherlands, those are 2 countries where this is also legal. This is determined by a physician expert in a particular disease. So if you're dying of stomach cancer, you need a stomach cancer specialist to sign off on it. You need to have exhausted other treatment options, so they need to say, have you tried chemotherapy? Yes, it didn't work, it came back. Have you tried radiation? Yes, it came back, it didn't work. Have you tried, I don't know what else, homeopathy? They will go through all the treatment options, and you have to have said either, yes, I've tried it, or they have to say, that wouldn't work in your case anyway. But you have to at least try the treatments, and they have to conclude that there's no other options. So MAiD comes into play when the medical system has failed you. Now, an interesting to note is when a doctor says, you are going to die in 6 months, there's no hope for you, they have a 47% chance of being correct. That's not great odds. Now, sometimes it might just be you have 12 months instead of 6 months, but sometimes it means a full recovery and they were totally wrong. But that's how they work here. Whereas here in Canada, we have a very different system. You tell the doctor, I'm suffering intolerably. They don't tell you, they don't do that for you. It doesn't have to be a doctor specific to that area of expertise. Any doctor can sign off on this. You don't have to have even tried other treatment options, you just have to know about them. And we consider MAiD a treatment. We don't consider it something that happens when the healthcare system has failed you. So one reason this gets disability advocates very worried is when mental health comes into play here, you can say to a patient, have you tried counseling? And they can say, no, and I don't want to. Have you tried antidepressants? No, and I don't want to. And all of those things, they don't have to even have tried it to access MAiD as things stand in Canada, whereas elsewhere they would have at least had to have given it a go for, I think, a 6-month period. So that's something that is of concern. Another thing that makes Canada different from the rest of the world is we increasingly have this idea that MAiD can be altruistic. So you'll hear the media talk about cost savings, and there's some pretty significant cost savings for MAiD. Something like 10 to 20% of our national healthcare budget goes towards people in the last year of life, which is 1% of the population. So nobody can deny it saves money. Now we all say, but that shouldn't be what drives this. We all agree on that. But there is something to knowing that you're saving money. We hear a lot about the burden of care. And sometimes when people talk about that burden, they mean in the healthcare system, you know, I'm tying up a bed that could go to somebody else. Sometimes what they mean is to the family. I don't like it that my family has to look after me. But those are the words we use, words like burdens or difficulties. Our healthcare system is not doing well right now, so to free up space could be a big deal. And here is one that really surprised me. Canada is the only country in the world that advocates MAiD for organ donations. So you can imagine it works much better because part of the issue is getting the organs to the people who need it in a timely manner. Whereas if you can plan it, if you can say, patient A is going to be on this bed, patient B on this bed, we're going to kill them and take their organs, and it just makes it exponentially more viable. But Canadians are starting to boast about this. 6% of all our organ donations come from MAiD. And I've done this, or I talked like this several times, and I had one group that kind of sat up straighter, like, good on us, look at us saving lives, right? And that, I feel like that's a little bit of our attitude in Canada, like, well, if we're going to die anyway, we might as well make it for altruistic reasons. Whereas when you look at the world, they're pretty horrified by this stat. So speaking of being horrified or not, how do people think of this? So this is where I had a hard time getting stats, because right now I can ask you, but 10 years ago I can't. So these are not equal to each other. But in 1996, the Canadian Council of Churches unequivocally denounced MAiD. They had nothing good to say about it. No thanks, no way. Now, there was a few denominations that chose not to sign off on that. The United Church was one where they said, we'll let each parish decide. But for the most part, evangelical churches said, nope, we want nothing to do with it. About 10 years later in 2011, now this comes from the United Kingdom, so not the same demographics, but they did a poll that said evangelicals were against all forms of assisted suicide. 60% of evangelicals said that. Whereas you get to Canada in 2022, and 82% of Protestants and 87% of Catholics say they support MAiD. Now this is self-identified, so we're not doing any tests to see do you go to church. We're just saying, do you identify as a Protestant? Yes. Do you support MAiD? Yes. That's how this poll was done, but that's a fairly high percentage. If we go outside of the Christian community, this is probably the most disturbing of my slides. This was a poll done for Canadians. They polled 1,000 Canadians, so it's not a huge poll, but they wanted to know if you agreed or disagreed with letting adults seek assisted suicide for various reasons. 27% agreed that it should be legal for people in poverty. 28% said it should be legal for homelessness. 51% said it should be legal if you can't receive medical treatment for whatever reason. 43% said it should be legal for mental illness, and 50% said it should be legal for disability. My guess is if we had done that poll 10 years earlier, the numbers would be 0. 0% think it should be available for poverty or homelessness. So what do we do with this? What does the Bible say about it? And those 82% of Protestants who now wholeheartedly support MAiD, did that come because they went to the Bible and were like, oh, obviously it's here? Or did that come through thoughtful reflection? Yes. Yeah. There's three colors, and they colored them wrong. So the red one, it's very small. The red one says agree. The yellow one says disagree. And the green one says not sure. I would have done those colors differently. I don't know if that's a UK thing but yeah. So the red one is the agree, the yellow is disagree. So, there's good news. 62% of Canadians still disagree that poverty should be a reason. 62% is not as high as I'd like, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So this is from an article in a magazine called Faith Today by Bill Fledendis wrote this. He said, the message of MAiD is that God did not create us and life is not his. Is he right? Is he wrong? Just looking back at the Bible, we see a couple things. One is life is always talked about as a gift from God. So if you go back to the Genesis story, we have God creating humanity out of the dust or out of a rib, and he breathes life into it. It's his spirit that he breathes into them. In Acts 17:25, it says God gives everyone life and breath and all things. So it talks about it coming from God. It's a gift of God. And now we're getting into language that's a bit more disconcerting, but Exodus 20:13 says we should not commit murder. And the reason I put that in, even though we don't like to think of this as murder, is because that's actually how the Canadian Law Code thought of it too. So in 2016, they had to change the homicide codes to have a loophole for nurse practitioners and doctors. So even the Canadian law says that this was homicide, and they've made a loophole saying it's not anymore. So I do think that those mandates to not commit murder would play into this. I did find one publication that did say, you know what, euthanasia is in the Bible, and therefore we should, not be so quick to dismiss it. So they said you can find death with dignity in the Bible, and they pointed to Judges 52 to 55. So this is a story about Abimelech. It says, Abimelech went to the tower and stormed it. But as he approached the entrance to the tower to set it on fire, a woman dropped an upper millstone on his head and cracked his skull. Hurriedly, he called to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me, so they can't say a woman killed him." So the servant ran him through and he died. So you get the picture here, right? It would be shameful for him to be killed by a woman, so he wanted to be killed by a man. So he had he knew he was dying, he had his armor-bearer kill him instead. Is this support for a death with dignity? Well, I have some questions. First off, it tells us a woman killed him. Second off, if we keep going, it does not condone this act. In fact, it calls Abimelech evil and says that God brought back his evil on him through this death. I had one professor mention, if you have issues with women killing you, should you have issues with women helping you too? Maybe we should be careful what we say here. But the whole point is they used it as proof that we should have euthanasia, but if you keep reading, it's pretty clear that that wasn't condoned. The same article talked about a compassionate response to suffering being shown in the story of Saul, King Saul. So this comes from 2 Samuel, verses 1 to 69. And I don't know if you know the story, remember the story, but King Saul was incredibly jealous of David, who had been anointed king but wasn't acting as king yet. And they had these battles going on. And there comes a point where King Saul is dead, and David, who is now the new king, is standing there, and a young man runs up to him. And this is where this comes into play. The young man says, "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, "and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and riders almost upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me and said, 'What can I do?' And then he said to me, 'Stand over me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.'" So this is kind of the perfect example, right, of somebody who is in pain, suffering, and wants to die, and he asks this young man to kill him. And so if you stop there, you can say, yeah, that is a compassionate response to suffering. But once again, I'd ask us to keep reading, because in the next few verses, that young man is convicted of murder. He murdered King Saul, and he himself gets the death penalty. So it's viewed as murder. So if those are our two examples of euthanasia in the Bible, I would be hesitant to put too much weight on that as being approval. In fact, I think if we're looking at something like MAiD, maybe the best biblical resource we have for that would be Job. Job is somebody who was suffering enormously, and there was no cure. Nothing was helping. And in fact, his wife and his family and friends said, "You should just die. It's time. You should just die," right? This is Job 2:9. His wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." And what was Job's response? He said, "You're talking like a foolish woman. Should we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. And so the biblical response to suffering isn't a compassionate death, but rather it's choosing to live through it. Now, this isn't the only thing, because I think there's one other big one, and that's where I maybe fell on looking at it as merciful and rare, and that's, what about compassion? How does compassion play into this? Because the Bible is very clear, be kind and compassionate to one another, Ephesians 4:32. And Jesus is compassionate, and God is talked all about his graciousness and compassion. So we know that God is compassionate, we know that Jesus is compassionate. How does that play into this? And so Dying with Dignity is the largest pro-MAiD advocacy group out there. And so they have a series of articles for Christians to help get rid of the stigma. And this is one of them. And she says, if someone was to ask me to describe what Christianity is without mentioning Jesus, my answer is compassion. And to be honest, I feel some compassion for that, I do understand when you're watching someone suffering to say, chin up, you'll be fine, when they won't. That's a difficult thing to say, but I did wonder if we were talking about the same thing. So this is Alan Verhey, who wrote a book called The Christian Art of Dying, Learning from Jesus. That's got to be something to write a book like that, hey? Well, he said this about compassion. He said, an ancient compassion had included the readiness to simply be present with a sufferer, the readiness to suffer with another. The modern compassion, in contrast, is formed not to share suffering, but to put a stop to it by means of technology. So compassion literally means come is with and passion is suffering. So what would it look like to suffer with somebody? That's not an easy one. But we're not the first to think about it. In fact, the Hippocratic Oath, which probably some of you are familiar with thanks to medical dramas on TV, it says do no harm, right? And it's never been legal in Canada, so we've never made doctors say this oath. But even back then, this came from the early Greeks, they had as part of it, I will give no deadly medicine to anyone if asked, nor suggest such counsel. So that was right in there in the Hippocratic Oath. But if that's the case, then how do we respond to people who are suffering, people who are dealing with pain management? Because I don't think our answer should just be to, grin and bear it. I think one thing we have to remember is in our society here in Canada, suffering is always bad. There's nothing good about suffering. Suffering is to be gotten rid of, eliminated, whatever we can do. And I took some Tylenol before coming here, so I'm right there with them, right? I'm not a big fan of suffering. But I do think as Christians we have a different call. It says here, Jesus' way of suffering, service, offers us Christians the opportunity to make sense of our suffering and to even see our pain as an expression of discipleship, and thereby to make a witness to the world, which thinks that all suffering is without meaning. I found that a bit convicting because when I think of the people I respect most, they're not people who had an easy life. They're people who've been through some really tough things, and I've seen them stand under some pretty impressive suffering. Some of it physical, some of it emotional, and I've seen them overcome. And their testimony is often what boosts my faith and boosts my courage. And I did think, what if that was the Christian witness? That we didn't run away from all suffering. Please run away from all needless suffering, but there's some suffering that maybe we're called to endure. This is a huge long quote. I'm not going to read it all. This is what the Pope wrote about it. Pope John Paul, back in 1995, the Catholic Church was writing some statements on it. But I think what it helps with is differentiating what is MAiD and what is not, because there's a lot of confusion about what it is. So one story that was told to me of a man who was nearing death and he was offered MAiD, and he thought he was getting a cleaning service. So they came in, thankfully, good people who went, oh, this is not what you wanted. So they left him alone. There's no horrific ending there. But it's a little bit, that's a little bit what it is. Not everybody knows what it is. Somebody else said, but pulling the plug, we've been doing that all along. Why are we getting so worked up about this? And I think the Pope has a really good differentiation where he talks about what is the cause of death. So taking somebody of life support, they're dying because they can't breathe anymore or because their heart can't beat on their own anymore. They're not dying of lethal injection. Even refusing treatment. So if you had kidney failure and decided not to take dialysis, you're dying of kidney failure, you're not dying of lethal injection. And that might just be splitting hairs to some people, but I think it's an important difference. We're not trying to avoid death. We're not people who are terrified of death. The Bible talks about death as a defeated enemy, but we are also not rushing to it. And so one of the things he asks, he says, we're not worried about, you don't have to take the aggressive medical treatment. You don't have to try and extend life as long as possible. But what we are saying is, but we're not going to let people die of lethal injection. So the question here would be, are we allowing someone to die or are we causing someone to die? And that would be the difference in MAiD. So it's not pulling the plug, it's not saying no to treatment. What it is allowing somebody to die versus causing someone to die. But it also brings to mind then what is causing people to say, I'd like MAiD? What is doing that? Is it that they're not getting enough palliative care? Is it the pain medication isn't working? Especially for those who don't have death as imminent, what are the motivations? And thankfully, Canada did a big study on this, and they looked at their motivations. And they said 86.3% of people chose MAiD because of loss of ability to engage in meaningful life activities. 81% chose MAiD because of a loss of ability to perform activities of daily living, so cooking your own meals or giving yourself your own bath. Only 59.2% said it was because of inadequate pain control or concern. 53% said it was a loss of dignity. 47% said that it was inadequate control of symptoms other than pain or concern. 35% said it was a perceived burden on family, friends, or caregivers. 30% said it was a loss of control of bodily functions. 17% said it was isolation or loneliness. That's the one that gets me every time. And then it goes on from there. What caught me about this is that little word, or concern. Because I heard a palliative care nurse make the charge that pain actually didn't rank on this list as a reason for people to take MAiD. So my image of someone dying of stomach cancer in the throes of pain and unable to have that managed was completely false. Now, she might be right. Inadequate pain control or concern of inadequate pain control. I don't know if it's the lack of pain control or if it's just fear of pain. I don't know that from this. So that got me on a bit of a hunt to go, why are people choosing MAiD? And this is from Oregon. So they asked there, what made you choose MAiD? And they just had a ranking system, 1 to 5. 5 is the most important. This is why I chose MAiD. 1 is the least important. This hardly ranks. And at number 5, so the biggest reasons people chose MAiD was a loss of independence or control. At the bottom of the list is pain. Pain didn't even rank as reasons for people choosing MAiD. Fear of loss of quality of life, fear of self-care ability, and fear of pain, that was all in the middle there. But pain itself didn't rank. I found one out of Vancouver, just done last year actually, that also had similar stats, and this is how they summed it up. They said existential suffering, which is a loss of autonomy or dignity, or an inability to engage in activities that they used to find enjoyable, rather than pain or physical symptoms, drive most MAiD requests in Canada. It's existential suffering, not pain or physical symptoms. So my image of what MAiD was turns out to be not largely what MAiD is here in Canada. And if that is true, then I think the church has a lot to say. Interestingly, the biggest groups working against MAiD right now are not churches or religious institutions, it's disability rights. So over 300 disability rights groups have written into Canada to stop the progress of MAiD. I don't know of any religious groups, although I'm sure some have. So these are just a few that I came across that said, you are important, you are valuable, your needs are important. Our organization will not recommend, suggest, or refer you to MAiD. What an interesting way of approaching it. So if this is about existential suffering, not pain, because I'm not a doctor, I don't know what drugs will help you, but I am a Christian, and I do know something about a God who speaks to dignity and purpose and existential suffering. So we have to start with asking, what is dignity? And there's 2 ways of looking at it. Is MAiD an offense against the dignity of the human person, which is what Pope John Paul II says? Or is it giving a person dignity through death, which is dying with dignity, the MAiD advocacy group, what they say? So we're using the word dignity, but we're seeing it from very opposite spectrums. One says, no, that robs you of dignity. The other says, yeah, that gives you dignity. So I think we need to acknowledge that there's going to be a bit of a disconnect between what the Canadian world says and maybe what Christians say. And some of that maybe we can bring together, and some of it maybe we can put apart. And I find that very difficult because we think of Christian and Canadian as very compatible. Christians are nice people, Canadians are nice people, what's the problem? But when you start getting into this, you think, oh, those both can't be true at the same time. Now we have an issue. So one of the questions we need to answer is, what makes us human? And Descartes famously said, I think, therefore I am. But I feel like that has come into our Western society very much. So we almost think of humanity as a soul that's imprisoned by the constraints of a body. So if you watch any futuristic movies, which I love, there's often these ideas of my consciousness will be uploaded either to a new body or to a big AI robot or something, and that way I'll get to live forever. That's what eternal life looks like. We talk about somebody with dementia as saying, well, their life is over. They've lived their best life already. We talk about our consciousness as being our true self, and our body is just what gets in the way. Whereas the Bible talks about it very differently. If you remember back to the Genesis story, he created bodies. That was the first part. And then he breathed life into it. So it's more that we're embodied souls or ensouled bodies. They go together. So yes, our consciousness is part of who we are, but so is our body. The Bible doesn't have any concept of humanity apart from living in these bodies. And that comes from Genesis 2:7, where God breathes life into the body, but also in the incarnation. So John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh, and he dwelt among us, and he made his home among us. And a part of our faith is that God actually lived in a body. That's a huge part of what makes us Christians, because we believe that actually matters to our faith. That if God had stayed up there in this disembodied form, we wouldn't have the salvation we have. And so we can't be too dismissive of these bodies that we have, not when Christ puts such an emphasis on it. Another difference that I think we need to acknowledge is what gives us value. So we live in a very consumer-driven society. We care deeply about our achievements. We're likely to say, what do you do for a living? And I don't think that's bad. A lot of our time is spent doing that. But we also have a crisis of people who, when they hit retirement, feel like they don't know who they are anymore, because that was not just how they earn money, that was their identity. We talk about being a contributing member to society, and we're very frustrated with people who aren't. Cost of living, that's a fairly obvious thing, but we add that to the cost of being in healthcare or the cost of having someone to look after you. And so we talk about our value in economic terms, and we want to be on the plus side. We want to be contributing, not a drain. Whereas the Bible talks about it very differently. We've got the words imago Dei, which means we're created in the image of God. So you get your value not because of what you do, you get it because of God, Spirit in you, being a child of God. You get it because God's fingerprint is on you. You get it because God said humanity was so precious that he sent his son to die for us. So our value no longer comes from what we do or how we contribute. It comes from being loved by God. In the same light, we talk about the burden of care, and I mentioned this before, and we have to ask, how much is too much? So just some stats for you. Provincial governments will save an estimated $140 million annually on the declines of end-of-life care. And I mentioned this one before. The healthcare costs of an individual in the last year of life represent 10 to 20% of total healthcare costs, even though it only represents 1% of the population. And so as much as we say, yes, but money doesn't drive it, we acknowledge there's a tension there. Whereas Christians see this very differently. Will Willimon, he was a bishop in the United Methodist Church, he said this: being a burden is what it means to be in a family. It's part of the price we pay for loving and being loved. And to look at a baby who contributes nothing, and say, you're a burden, I can't have you here anymore, that's unthinkable to us. But we're very quick to say it at the end of life, aren't we? One of the interesting things, there's a very famous passage in Matthew 28 to 30, sorry, that's a typo there, where Jesus says, come to me, all you are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. But when he continues, he doesn't say, and I'll take the burden from you and I'll carry it. Rather, he says, I will give you a new burden. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. So you don't get to be burden-free. That's not a possibility, but what you do get is Jesus walking with you, carrying a burden that's possible. And so there is no vision of a burden-free life in the Bible. What there is a vision of is not doing it alone and being part of a community who loves you. Another one, and we hear this not just about MAiD, but everywhere, my body, my choice, right? Personal autonomy is king in Canada. We care deeply about this. And this is maybe the most inflammatory thing I'm going to say tonight, and that is, as a Christian, we give that up. 1 Corinthians 6:19-20 says, don't you know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price, so glorify God with your body. I don't get to say, my body, my choice, when I've given my life to Christ. It's his vessel now, and I choose to surrender my autonomy to him as a Christian. And the Bible is full of these imagery. It's never an island. It's never you alone. It's always we as a community are living stones who put together are a living temple. We together are the body of Christ, and if one part suffers, we all suffer. We together are a priesthood of believers. We together belong to one another. And so part of the Christian life is not only surrendering your autonomy to Christ, but then choosing to live that out in obedience to what the Bible says and how the Holy Spirit leads, and surrendering that to the fellowship of the saints, to have some people who have a right to say something into your life. So if we're to think Christianly about this, we have to remember that we are made in the image of God, that we are not our own. Our autonomy has been surrendered, but that we are seen as precious and beloved. We have been redeemed by Christ, and that these bodies have a future. It doesn't matter how broken and painful they might be, that they will be part of the resurrection story and pain-free and recreated in Christ, but that they are not disposable. Our bodies are united with Christ, and they are a temple of the Holy Spirit. Now, as I was kind of researching this and gathering stories for this, I happened to be, this wasn't on the same topic, happened to be reading a book by Will Willimon, he's the bishop I mentioned, called Aging, Growing Old in the Church. And what really struck me about it is all these reasons we see here for why people took MAiD, they're all in this book on aging. The loss of ability to engage in meaningful life activities, that happens as you grow old. The loss of ability to perform activities of daily living, that happens. Inadequate pain control. Aches and pains are part of growing old. Loss of dignity, that's part of growing old. Inadequate control of symptoms other than pain, happens when you grow old. Perceived burden on family, friends, or caregivers, like all of these things, even the loneliness and loss of control, that all happens as part of aging. And so I had to stop and say, is MAiD more about growing old than it is about managing pain? And if that's the case, how worried should we be? Because when we're thinking of compassion, what's a compassionate response to the loss of ability to engage in meaningful life activities? My guess is our knee-jerk reaction wouldn't be a lethal injection. What's a compassionate response to loss of ability to perform activities of daily living? I don't know, home health care? What's a compassionate response to fear of future pain or suffering? When you look at all of these things, what's a compassionate response to loneliness? My guess is for none of these would we talk about death. And, well, I will not say that I think that Canada is trying to kill our old people. I don't think there's any nefarious agenda at play here. But but I do think it's something to be concerned about because our seniors are disproportionately affected. So 10% of deaths on Vancouver Island, which is a popular retirement community, are due to MAiD. That's a lot. The average age of those choosing MAiD is 77, and 80% of people choosing MAiD are over 65. So this matters to our seniors. And someone pointed out to me the fifth commandment. So that's honor your father and mother in the Lord, for this is right. I don't know about you, that was taught to me as I was a kid, and kind of by the time I hit my teens, I stopped teaching it. Right? It's for kids. Kids need to honor their father and mother, and then you grow up. But it was pointed out to me that this commandment was given at the same time the commandment against adultery and against murder was given, because it was given to mostly adults. Moses had the Hebrews kind of gathered there at the mountain, and they were about to go on a 40-year camping trip. And he's telling them, these adults, to honor your father and mother, because you know how much help someone who's dying is on a camping trip? You're going to have to carry them. You're going to have to feed them. You're going to have to look after all of their needs, and it's not going to be easy because you don't have the luxuries of a hospital right there. And so when he's giving this commandment to honor your father and mother, he's giving it to adults for their aging parents. Now, I think it's also relevant to kids, and I say that as a parent, but I do think that we need to remember that this commandment was given because we are called to honor our seniors. And this is where I want to get into how does the church do this well? How do we get to the place where the church is leading the way in aging with dignity? How do we get to the place where we can respond to loneliness? Because honestly, if I was face-to-face with that stomach cancer patient who was about to die, I don't know what I would say. That's a tough one. So And I'm not here to legislate against all forms of MAiD because, I read about the prohibition and think that didn't work particularly well. So I don't know that I would be out there picketing, but I do know this. I don't want anyone else to die because they're lonely. Not when the church is around. I don't want anyone else to die because they feel like they have no purpose anymore. Not when the church is around. I want people to know that they're beloved. I want people to feel like there's a community who supports them, and I want the church to be prophetic in saying life is precious, even when it involves suffering. And so we're going to turn it over to you soon, but one thing I've been looking for as a church is what resources are there for seniors? Because honestly, there's not a lot. You hit retirement, you'll probably get a financial planner to sit down and talk with you. They're probably not from the church, but that might be the only advice you get. And so we have a youth group, and our youth, I could go to a conference every single weekend on youth group and I wouldn't hit them all. There are books, there are resources, there's everything out there for youth. But when I started looking for seniors, there's not a lot, is there? It's hard to find things. And so when we've been, as a church, going, what can we do to support our seniors, some of the best things have been unprogrammed. We got a couple ladies in the church who are like phone warriors. They will remember that you were missed church, and they will pick up the phone, and they'll call you and check in on you and make sure you're okay. They call some of the shut-ins daily almost. I think they are doing God's holy work in that, and I wish we could honor that a little bit more. We have a Bible study in our church that's led by a 95-year-old lady. Some of you, hit retirement and you think, now I can retire from teaching Sunday school, now I can retire from all these things. You don't retire from being a disciple of Jesus. Now it might change. You might not run around with the youth anymore. You might do something different. But you don't retire from being a disciple of Jesus. And when we see these people who have age and wisdom, who are contributing to a church, not because that's the value, but because they are valued, I think that's a beautiful thing. That you're putting this online right now, there are some people for whom coming out here for an evening is a difficult thing. But they're interested and they care. And so that you're making it accessible for people who can't get out, I love that. I think that's really important, and I think we need more of that. And I want churches, I get that we want to attract the youth. I get that we're worried about the next generation, and I don't want to undermine that, but I also don't want to treat our seniors like they're disposable. And I want churches to talk a little bit more about what that looks like to honor our fathers and our mothers when we're at a Sunday school age. So here's just some that we know. Advisors with a Purpose is a Christian organization, a nonprofit that you can access that will talk with you about will making and things like that. They don't have anything to sell, which is really nice. Here's a few of the resources our church got to. But mostly where I want us to go from here, because I don't think we are going to agree on everything. And I think there's some of you that have some very personal stories about MAiD that are not easily solved in a package presentation, right? But I do want to say, if your picture of MAiD was like mine, somebody dying of stomach cancer in great pain, a week left to live, we need to acknowledge that that might have been the intent of it, but that's not what it is currently. And if we want to make any difference, we're going to have to address the actual motivations behind taking MAiD, which means we've got to have a new vision of human dignity that isn't about what you contribute to society, but it's about you being loved by God. We need to start honoring this body, and I think this is really hard for Christians. A lot of us have this escapist, the body will die and my soul will go to heaven and I never have to deal with this body again. But the Bible doesn't talk about it that way. It talks about a resurrection of the body as well. And I think, and this is the tough one, there are times where we're called to suffer for the cause of Christ. But I think the good news, the hopeful news, is that churches can actually have a say in this. We can address loneliness. We're perfect for that. We're set up for that. We can address loss of purpose. That is our game. This is what we're good at. We can have conversations about aging well and even dying well. And so I find that really hopeful that if we can be honest about the real motivations behind MAiD, man, churches are right there in the forefront of that, and we can make a difference. One stat I heard is that 9 out of 10 people who are considering MAiD and want to talk to someone about it don't go through with it. 9 out of 10. We need to talk about this more. All those people that came up to me kind of sidling up saying, I know someone. Let's get this out in the open. And some of that means getting rid of some of the stigma to say, someone I love died of MAiD and I'm having a hard time with it. And some of that means just being a little bit more willing to talk about death. We don't talk about that easily, do we? But to be able to talk about that openly, I think makes a big difference. John Wesley, he's the founder of Methodism, and back in the day, I think 1700s, churches were he was planting churches left, right, and center. And so when he was asked why his churches were growing so quickly, his response was, because our people know how to die well. Well, here in Canada, our churches are not growing quickly. We're shrinking and we're dying. But I wonder if we are in a season where we have a witness and a testimony of being people who live with hope and die with hope. And so may this be true in our churches as well. Where have you seen the church succeed in terms of addressing aging well? Have you seen the church do some really innovative or unique things? Or are there some things that we just do naturally that you value? Or are there holes, places where we could get better at this? What practical ways can Christians address loneliness in our society? And I feel like the pandemic just made us see for the first time how lonely people are. But I don't know that we found a lot of good solutions. So what are some ways we can address it? Is there ways we can dismantle the defensiveness around these conversations so that we can have those conversations with people we know, we love, even with each other, around death or MAiD or some of these big topics? So I'll leave it with those three in particular, and I'll maybe change the slide once in a while just so you don't completely lose where you are. But I think those are topics worth discussing together, so I'll leave that there.